Thanks, Jason. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So excited to be here. So about 15 years ago, I found myself in a conversation with an architecture professor. She was super cool. She had blue hair, and it was kind of like chopped up. And I was considering being an architect. I was trying to figure out whether or not I wanted to go to architecture school. I was then trying to figure out if I do go to school, how can I actually get in? And so, we had this great conversation. I thought she was, kind of hip, and I was a little bit intimidated, but, we hit it off. Towards the end of the conversation, she said something to me, and she said, whatever you do, just please don't write that you want to change the world through design on your application essay. I have to read so many of them. It's so boring. Cliche. And so, for me, it was a shock because that was why I wanted to go to architecture school. And it might be, I'm wondering whether it's the same for a lot of folks here. So my story is that I think of myself as a social worker in a designer's body. Obviously, it's a designer's body because we have much better fashion sense. But my mom is a social worker. She worked with abused children and their families for 40 years. I grew up in a household that was always thinking about who got left out and how to bring them in. We were constantly thinking about issues of inclusion, kindness, and it was just, obviously I want to do something like this, right? That's going to be my pathway. But like many of you, I was also this creative. I was constantly making things. I did an independent study in fashion design, when I was in high school. And so when I found landscape architecture, I could see a way of doing the kind of work I wanted to do in the world, and I could see a way that actually brought together my creative interests. And so I did end up writing my essay about how I wanted to change the world through design. I guess somebody must have been, not paying attention because they let me in. And what I found very quickly was that the real question was not, is this a thing to want? Can I change the world through design? But it was really about the question of how can I change the world through design? Because we get a lot of messages that say that this is really hard to do, right? That, you're this bleeding heart, or, what do you want to do? Found a nonprofit, and so we get these messages that this is going to be quite difficult to do in terms of orienting our careers in order to make the kinds of impacts that we want to make. So what I have done since is I founded 2 businesses. I run Creative Agency, which is a design and research firm that works on social impact issues. I work a lot in the affordable housing industry. I work on issues of the public realm. And I also run Build Yourself, which is an empowerment and coaching and training company for women in creative fields. I work with women in design, tech, engineering, and I work with them to grow in their careers and businesses, and then to actually make those careers and businesses better, more equitable for the people who come up after them. So what I've done today is I've pulled together 3 lessons that I've learned along the way on how to be a creative agent of change, how to use your creativity to make the impact that you want to see in the world. And I am excited to share them with you and share part of what I've been learning throughout the process. My first lesson is to be systems curious. So right before I started in landscape architecture school, I had this special job, a life-changing job. I got a chance to work for a place called Public Architecture, which is based in the Bay Area and was a public interest design firm. They were working on issues that the private market didn't have an incentive to take on. We worked on a solution to day laborers and how to make sure that day laborers get access to the services they need. We worked on accessory dwelling units, so trying to do urban infill and suburban infill. And I was the lowest person on the totem pole during the recession, and so very, very quickly it became me and a couple of senior staff who were above me. And so I got access to all kinds of interesting conversations. When I think about my time there, it was everything from what's the big vision of our strategic plan down to, hey, can we afford to buy a printer or do we need to lease one? And I found myself thinking, okay, I got a chance to see how this work is done, like in the belly of the beast, but like, is this the only way to do it? Is this the only model or pathway in order to do this work? And so in my last year of grad school, they really wanted everyone to do landscape architecture theses, and I decided to take a slightly different path. I decided to research business models of social impact design. Now, let me say that I had no clue what I was talking about. I didn't even really know what a business model was. So I went out and got all these, I Googled business models and just printed out a lot of articles on it, pulled together a lit review, kind of just fumbled my way in the dark, figuring out, I was I don't think I'm trying to answer the question of, can we afford to buy a printer? But I think I'm asking something that's somewhat related to that, but I'm not even sure what it was. And so I ended up, I also didn't know that this would be a 5-year journey. I ended up linking together with a friend of mine from public architecture, Nick McClintock. We linked together with a friend, Gilad Marone. The three of us started off researching what started as an independent study, turned into a research study, case studies on business models of social impact design that was actually funded by the NEA. And so part of what we did when we did this work is that we really tried to look at these businesses as a system. A lot of the culture of architecture and design is a little bit of a kind of coffee table book culture. We have these beautiful books that we get published, and it's ooh, look at this beautiful project, look at this project. I did this, and it's gorgeous, and here's a gorgeous photo with nobody in it that just shows how fantastic these design decisions were. But what I really wanted to understand is, okay, in these social impact design projects, what's making that project possible? What's the system that makes it possible to do that project and then to get up the next day and do another one, right? Are these things one-offs, or is there really a way to sustain a career doing this kind of work? And we really looked at it, we looked at it as systems thinkers. We pulled out our design strategists. We researched it like we would research an ecosystem. So, made diagrams comparing firm by firm by firm on, elements like their revenue model or their strategic positioning or key partnerships or assets that they had. We also looked at, the traditional design process from pre-design all the way to construction administration, right? That's the way that we typically see design, but what we started to find was that a lot of the firms that were doing innovative work were doing things off of that traditional spectrum, right? They were redesigning the design business model. One of the things I feel really proud of is that we also looked at the numbers, right? At the end of the day, you would never design a hotel and not ask, wait, how many rooms do you want to have in this thing, right? You would never design a school without understanding how many students are gonna be in the district or need to use the facilities. And so sometimes when we talk about the stories of our businesses, we talk about them in these abstract terms, whereas we also wanted to say, okay, well, let's look at relationships, key relationships and thresholds. Let's look at, this is one of the firms we studied, Mass Design Group. Who are they serving and what services are they offering? Where does their revenue come from and what percentage of their work is that? One of the firms we researched is not a traditional social impact design firm, but I think is very much a social impact design firm in terms of its impact. We researched Andrea Cochran Landscape Architecture, which does super, super high-end, beautiful work. I drool when I see her projects. And whenever it's possible, when they're not in a recession, they always try to have one low bono, not pro bono, low bono project on the books in affordable housing. And a lot of their affordable housing projects are award-winning, have raised the bar for what affordable housing can be. I see affordable housing all across the country and people reference these projects, right? And so really, really making an impact, even though it might actually be a tiny percentage of her workload, that we jokingly refer to her firm as a Robin Hood model, because that high-end work is actually subsidizing that low-end work, that low bono work. So really, really trying to, just like you would do a design project, that level of analysis. So a couple for any of you who are interested in doing this kind of work, just a couple of quick findings from what I learned in looking at model after model after model and looking at it this way. First is to find the gaps in the market. So there's a firm named Inkscape Studio Publico, and Inkscape Studio is a traditional architecture firm, and their founder, Greg Kearley, figured out after trying to work with nonprofits that when nonprofits can least afford design services, so at the point when maybe they're outgrowing their space, they need new, they know that they need new space, but they're not quite sure what do they need, and do we need a new building, should we rent somewhere else? Like they don't even know how to frame the problem. That's when they can least afford design services. Because what do you need to raise money for a capital campaign? You need to know A, how much money you need to raise. B, you need some super sexy rendering that's oh yeah, I'm gonna write you a check right now. And those are the things that you don't have if you haven't worked with a designer. And so what Greg Kearley decided to do was to create a nonprofit, Inkscape Publico, right? Kind of clever. And Inkscape Publico would work alongside Inkscape Studio and would take on projects working with nonprofits at subsidized rates, so at about 30% of their normal design fees, and would take the project from pre-design all the way through highly detailed schematic design. And so nonprofits would have these packages that they could take, they could get bids, they would have enough images to sell the project, and then they were allowed to come back to Inkscape Studio after they raised the money, if they were able to raise the money, and to work with them at full rates for design development all the way through construction administration, which is oftentimes where a lot of fee comes in because it's super, super time consuming to do those things. And because Inkscape Publico was a nonprofit, they could bring in grants and subsidize that work. So it was really hacking the business model in order to really meet the needs of nonprofits and fill the gaps in the market. Second thing that we found is get creative about revenue. So I want to introduce you to a firm or an organization that I really like named Public Workshop. Public Workshop was founded by Alex Gilliam, and Public Workshop is based in Philadelphia, where there's a lot of issues, education, urban health issues, tons of stuff that is so much more pressing, and built environment issues always end up on the bottom of the list. And so what Alex did is he developed a program where he trains youth to not just build interventions in their communities, but identify what needs to be built in our community. Do we need a playground? Do we need benches? Do we need this? Do we need that? And in doing so, he actually accesses youth development funding streams, and it's almost like a two birds with one stone approach, where the outcomes are not just improved built environment when it's something that needs to happen in Philadelphia, but it's not on the top of the list, but also not only youth job training, but civic leadership, right? These are youth who are learning to identify issues in their community and then propose solutions. So when I was in school, one of the things we focused a lot on was drawing, right? Draw this, draw that, draw all the layers, understand, how the naked mole rat relates to the bald eagle, and stick it all in some complex axonometric. But one of the places that I think sometimes as designers that we get stuck is that we may not be focusing on the right systems all the time, or we may need to kind of step off of the physical system sometimes to really understand those complex human systems that surround how our work happens, how things get built, how decisions get made. And so even though now I work more as a strategist, I haven't done a planting plan in years, even though I was really good at them. I use this approach, this kind of analytic approach, to really understand a system and then start to understand what's possible in that system. So I do a training with creative leadership in design offices, where I help train them on unconscious bias, unconscious race and unconscious gender bias. And what's different about my training is that we really look at it as a design problem. You know, I give them a framework around the common places that bias can come up in workplace and in your personal leadership. And then I ask them to do a site analysis of where bias could be coming up in their organization. You know, then we can actually, you know, there's a ton of design solutions around how to address it, whether we change our hiring processes or our promotion or office culture, but it's really about using that systems thinking way to change the way that we design the cultures that we live and work in, right? These human systems. When I did a project for the Highline Network, which is a new network founded by the Highline, in order to help other projects that are industrial reuse projects get built, make them happen, these highly programmed spaces. One of the challenges that came up was equitable development and displacement. The founders of the Highline feel like they missed a couple of steps or missed a couple of opportunities when it came to how the Highline could be a proactive agent of equity. But one of the challenges is, you know, a parks project is just a project, right? It's not the city government, it's not the zoning board, it's not, you know, and so one of the narratives is, oh, you know, well, we don't have the power to do that, right? We have limited impact. And so part of what I did is I started to pull together where I was seeing these projects have an impact on issues of equity and issues of anti-displacement, and say, okay, well, we may not have all of the agency, but there's ways that you have direct agency, right? Who you hire in your organization, what your programming is, and if your programming is proactively welcoming to people who are non-white and not in higher income groups, all the way to indirect influence. And here's some of the ways that projects are having that influence and being proactive agents of equity. So right now I'm working on a project, you know, one of the reasons why kind of thinking in this systems curious way is so important is that, you know, there are these trade-off narratives, right? It's you know, can we work on equitable development, or is that someone else's job? I'm working on a project right now, I'm in the strategic planning process for a amazing creative placemaking project in Salem. So it is a outdoor art museum. It's a collection of murals. Many of them are on Latino themes. It's in a predominantly immigrant neighborhood. And the cool thing about this project is that it is all on affordable housing. It's done by a community development organization that owns much of the land. So questions of displacement, right? Not everyone, you know, rents won't just rise and people will get kicked out, because there's actually a sophisticated land development anti-displacement strategy that's part of this process. But one of the things that comes up when you're working on a project like this is that sometimes, like those really difficult design projects, but also those projects that are sometimes so amazing, turns out there's all these like competing forces. Community development organizations don't usually invest in arts, right? You know, community development organizations like spend their days, you know, either organizing tenants or like in spreadsheets, like doing real estate deals. The arts world doesn't like, you know, even know what a developer fee is, or, you know, like what an equity stake is. And so finding ways to integrate these two aspects of a program and to figure out how do you make a really strategic program that's laser focused on the goals that it's trying to achieve for its neighborhood is not an easy thing. And so this is where that understanding systems and being able to visualize them helps us start to see opportunities or interesting ways to mesh things that we couldn't have seen otherwise. You know, I have to mention that, you know, there are these narratives around trade-offs, right? Make an impact or make money. You know, one of the trade-offs that I hear people talk about is like, oh, will I be successful, or will I get to be like an artist, right? You know, I work a lot with women, and I hear them say, some of them, you know, oh, well, you know, I don't know if I want to do that because I really want to have a family, right? And many of these trade-offs come from the things that we see around us, right? The trade-offs that we see other people make, or conventional wisdom. But conventional wisdom is really this dumb tool, this blunt object. And the great thing about being systems curious and really mapping things is that we start to see the cracks in the facade. we start to see, okay, well, yeah, right, many artists don't make a living, but here's some of the ways that I think we could do that, right? Here are some of the models or the recipes or the pathways to have more of the things that we want. So when I was in school, one of my favorite studios was a studio on Walden Pond. When I was, it was one of the best studios that I ever had. You know, Walden Pond is just down the road from where I went to school, and we could just, like, I could go over there for a weekend, go swimming, like, you know, do like weird hippie psychogeographic walks in the woods and like explore the canopy and ground. And so, great studio, super creative. But one day I decided that instead of measuring things, I wanted to go out and talk to real people. So one of my studio exercises was to go out. Our studio was all about changing conceptions of nature, right? How our relationship to nature has been changing since the book Walden was written. So I went out and I interviewed people about like their relationship to nature. And I brought back this like ugly diagram with, you know, like people and like their statements and whatever. And my studio professor was like, this isn't real design work. This isn't design work. Like, go back to the cool circles that you were drawing. But, you know, I ended up with with the best project that I'd done the entire time that I was in school. I ended up redesigning Walden as a temporal experience from the perspective of someone visiting it. You know, I didn't think primarily about the site. I thought about the human experience and then what the site could do for that human experience. I'm super proud of the project that I made. I don't think I could have come up with it any other way. And, you know, what it was really about was recognizing that sometimes we aren't really asking the right questions, right? We're focused, like I said, on the naked mole rat or like the hydrological patterns, but we really need to be getting out there, talking to people, and being what I call obsessively human. So being obsessively human is about paying attention to real people, real people's lives. When I was in school, we focused on military landscapes and we focused on mining landscapes, right? You know, it was really revolutionary that landscape architecture wasn't just a garden or a campus. But one of the things that always rubbed me the wrong way was I was like, well, you know, yeah, I'm glad that we're kind of, you know, expanding the scope of landscape architecture, but like, can we talk to a miner about like their experience, you know, and as we redesign the mining landscape? Like, can we call up a mining company and understand why do they make the choices that they do? Why do they mine it this way instead of that way? Like, what's the pressures on them? What's their incentives, right? Can we really get inside their heads? Because if we do, then we really understand how to influence the system. Now, one of the places that designers can get stuck is that sometimes we come up with these ideas and we haven't stopped to talk to the people who are influenced by them, right? This is why listening becomes, I think, one of the most important tools in the design toolkit. When you listen, you will hear all kinds of things that you didn't know otherwise because you come to a situation with your own biases. One example from a friend of mine who works in an arts organization in Atlanta, he was working on a project that would bring arts to public transit spaces. And one of the things that they found in their listening sessions was that residents just wanted the city to actually repair the broken sidewalks. Like, they didn't want fancy schmancy arts, they just wanted basic city services. And so part of what he was able to do was to craft a project so that it brought awareness to those other streetscape issues so that, you know, he could help residents raise their hands and say, we're here and yeah, we need our sidewalks to be fixed. So listening is really about like getting outside of your head, getting outside of your ego, like being curious about other people's experiences. We are all biased. If you are curious about how biased you are, whether you are, you know, a woman, a person of color, who, you know, whatever background you are, we are all biased. And if you're curious, you can take the implicit association test, which is a bias test that Harvard provides. And what you find is that everybody is biased. We know that women get interrupted more than men, but it turns out they get interrupted more than men by both men and women. We know that bias influences our design process. Up until the 1980s, National Institute of Health Studies it was acceptable for studies to be done on men, like heart disease studies, and then for everyone to just assume like, oh, it's probably true for women too. So we bring these unconscious assumptions into our design work. The city of Toronto, knowing that this was an issue in its planning work, actually just commissioned a market research and demographics firm to look at the city and to come up with these little archetypes. They're almost like, like video game characters for planners to keep in mind as they make their planning decisions. So, rather than kind of subconsciously, unconsciously defaulting to a white male, oftentimes middle-class norm, now they have a specific person and they think, okay, well, what would she think, right? This First Nations person who's an elderly woman, right? How can we design for her? So being obsessively human can actually change the way that you design. So when I was teaching at the Boston Architectural College, one of the things I assigned my students to do was to interview residents and then to actually draw their lives as comic strips and to make sure that the landscape architecture was actually the background, right? At the end of the day, it's about someone's life and their personal drama. One of my students interviewed someone with mobility issues, and it helped him think really differently about her process of scanning the landscape to find a place to sit because she can only walk so far. When I was asked by an affordable housing organization to do an exhibition, I also thought in an obsessively human way. And being obsessively human also means not just creating the thing, but creating the experience. So they asked me to run an exhibition, and when I read about the projects that they wanted to focus on, I was struck by how often these projects were really focused on food, right? They were community organizing, creative placemaking projects. People were constantly coming together for food, and I said, maybe let's not make an exhibition that stays in a couple of institutions. We should make a cookbook. And if we make a cookbook, then we can represent these stories, right? A cookbook is really a recipe, it's a process. And we wrote them so that they reflected the culture of the communities that they were based in. And actually, each one of these case studies has a real recipe from the community it was based in. So if you ever want to know how to make oxtail soup, you can pick up this book. But part of it was to really say, cooking is one of the most creative things that most of us do. And many of us are like, well, I don't really like cumin. I think I'm going to throw in some paprika instead. And so to give people permission to make it their own and to do it their own way. Then we decided, let's not stop at a cookbook. Let's do a training, and let's actually make the training a meal. So we created a 3-course meal that was a training in how to do creative placemaking this way, in this deeply community grounded way. And everybody at the table had a different role to play, whether you were serving the meal or you were the person who was responsible for facilitating the conversation for one of the conversation pairings that we did. We loved this training so much that we decided then, the 2 years later, to take it to talk about one of the thorniest issues that we have to face in today's world, and we decided to do a meal to have people talk about racial equity and how we could be proactive agents of racial equity in our design work. And so part of what was obsessively human about this meal is to recognize that trust and vulnerability is a really, really big part of how we come into any situation. There's something about breaking bread together and serving each other and eating and sharing together that starts to break down some of those barriers. Can't break down everything, right? A meal is not by nature a safe space, but we tried to design an experience in which people could walk out of the situation making commitments to how they would design differently in order to be agents of racial equity. What's cool about the meal is that we actually turned it into a meal kit. So if you guys want to run a Design for Equity meal in your studio, you can. It's got a little facilitator's guide. And we actually had Urban Housing Solutions in Nashville. They did one of these meals a couple of months ago and went super well and facilitated some really important conversations. So being obsessively human, when you bring it together with being systems curious, you can do some pretty awesome things. So a few years ago, I was working on a project for an affordable housing organization that was working on home ownership on native lands. Super, super hard to do, super long road. It was this like 100+ page manual. My goal was to make it, like to make someone actually want to take it off the shelf and read it. So like a few pictures, humanize it a little bit. One of the things that I found was that there's so much stuff you need to know about in order to do homeownership on native lands. You need to know about all kinds of complicated financial products. You need to know about legal protections that will strengthen the tribe if they're going to allow mortgage lending on their reservation. And when I really looked at who had been able to achieve success, it was the story of resilience and taking one step after the other and not giving up after setback after setback after setback. So I put together a diagram. This was unasked for by my client, but I said, I really think that there's an opportunity to not just put the information out there, but to provide a really human experience of guiding homeownership professionals step by step into making this real, right? And that means like support from each other. That means all kinds of emotional stuff that's not just about whether you know what a Section 183 loan is. And so I handed this off to my client. I said, I could see you, like I organized it so you could use this in a funder meeting and walk them through the obstacles that professionals face. And maybe you could say, we really want to focus on this. We'd love to raise some money for it. Like, what do you say? And what's great is that, about 6 months ago, that funder, right, it took a couple years, but they came back to me and they said, we were able to raise money for this cohort. And now we've got an amazing dream team that works a lot in Indian country that is putting together this cohort, this curriculum, and this experience. So, okay, be systems curious. Great, okay, cool, on it. Be obsessively human. I actually was recently reading the redesign report, and I found that you guys call it something very similar, same finding. You guys call it being fundamentally human. So yeah, be obsessively human, be obsessive, be a fundamentalist, be whatever you want, but just be human with whatever you do. So, all right, cool. Like, why aren't we changing the world? Like, what's missing? What's wrong? So what's missing is a mindset piece, and this is where you're going to see my little empowerment coach slide in. So when I talk to creatives, they have this sense of just, they're small standing in the world, right? Like, no one listens to us. We have no power. They come to us after the brief has already been set. Like, they're just like, oh yeah, like, make it pretty. And these things are somewhat true, right? Like, just like, conventional wisdom, there's a grain of truth. When I was working out of the Harvard iLab and was involved with a group of entrepreneurs at Harvard, I was the only design person in the room. And I would hear people say all kinds of stuff. Like, they'd be like, oh yeah, I need this like whole thing, this whole design thing. Like, I think I could pay a design student like, I don't know, $100 to get that done. Like yeah, like whatever, like undervaluing design, like of course they could do it. Designers not getting equity stake in the projects that they work on, right? Like, yes, we're not seen as powerful, we're not seen as fundamentally important as law, as business, as economics, right? Not seen as powerful. Too many ideas, like, oh, how could I ever do anything? I have so many ideas, I'm wishy-washy. Like, I'm onto this, and then next week I'm onto that, right? Self-perception, but also perceptions that maybe other people have of us. And also underselling our value. One of the challenges with studio culture, at least the way that I was educated, the idea was that you just put more time into the problem, right? There were architecture professors who would come in on the weekends to make sure, to see who was working on the weekends, just to see like who's really committed to design. And while I think it's really important to throw yourself into learning a new craft, if you buy into that model a little too much, then instead of learning how to solve problems with limited resources and using those limited resources in the most effective way, instead you learn, oh, let's just throw more time at it. And then you get into situations where you're giving away your time, you're giving away your work, you're not even doing, you're doing pro bono work for the absolutely wrong reasons. Your functional hourly rate is like, $7.72, and so like these are some of the mindset things that we bring into this work. It's not an accident, by the way. I think that these are some of the things that come up when I work with women. So with women, right, we're not seen as powerful. And research shows that the bias that we carry around, this shows up, right? So There's a study that actually showed that in terms of performance management, performance and promotion decisions, men in the study were more likely to be promoted based on their future potential. Like, yeah, we can see him in that role, in part because we're used to seeing men in leadership roles. Women were more likely to be promoted based on their past accomplishments. Like, she did it, sure, she can do it again, right? We're less likely to extend that benefit of the doubt for women in terms of their power and potential in the future. Women also sometimes struggle with people-pleasing. Girls are actually yelled at more by teachers when they talk out of turn, when they don't follow the rules. There's this understanding that boys will be boys, and girls are trained from very early ages to listen to authority figures, to follow the rules, right? So maybe you don't have too many ideas, but maybe there's too many cooks in the kitchen in your head. Women also are much less likely than men to negotiate and to negotiate for their value and for their worth. And so there's actually a study that showed that women are 2 to 3 times, and we talked about this in the workshop yesterday, 2 to 3 times less likely than men even to initiate a negotiation, even to recognize, wait a second, I could ask for more, whether that's more money or more influence on the project or more access to key decision making. And so for me, one of the reasons why I chose to be not just a designer but also a coach is that at the end of the day, these are issues of agency and power. And I'm obsessed with bringing more agency and power to the creative fields because I think that we have a huge contribution to make. And I also think that we have a contribution to make in terms of building the power of people who need more power. So, solution to this, claim your agency. Now, I have to say, this is harder than it sounds, claiming your agency. Because claiming your agency is going to require more of you. It's going to require more of your full self. It's going to require you to put yourself out there. It's going to require you to get outside of your comfort zone. One of the ways that we can claim our agency is, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but we can propose instead of waiting for permission. So, one of the things I did, we can do this with clients. One of the things I did when I was working with Americans for the Arts was I wanted to walk the walk. I wanted to hire artists in the doing of my work, and I wanted Americans for the Arts to do the same thing. So I proposed that we take some of my fee and actually reroute it to local artists who would do part of the graphic design work. And initially my client was a little bit hesitant because it wasn't the way that they normally contracted for projects. And I pushed for it, and they consented. And so in the end, we ended up having commissioning an artist to make these incredible, beautiful icons that were the shining element of the project, right? They were a huge hit, and we can't imagine the project without them. And part of it was me being willing to say, nope, maybe we're doing it differently than we've done it before, but let's try it this time, right? I really believe that we can do it this way. So being able to push for things, even when they're not the way that clients usually do them. One of the easiest ways that you can be a proactive agent for equity if you're working on a public project is to suggest to your client that they have childcare at events, at community meetings, right? Better for the client, you get a broader swath of the community. Better for people who have small children who can't afford childcare or feel like they're not supposed to bring their kid to the meeting. Second solution is to let your creativity go big. So there's a guy, his name's Archie Lee Coates. He and his collaborator in an organization called PlayLab put out this Kickstarter a couple years ago called the Plus Pool. They're like, we're gonna have a floating pool in the Hudson. It's gonna be awesome. It's gonna filter some water. You could go swimming in the Hudson, even though you kind of can't go swimming in the Hudson. It's gonna be so cool. Let's put it up on Kickstarter. In their Kickstarter, they included this diagram, which I love because it's looks super smart. And on the other hand, it's also kind of okay, where's the tech? So they propose oh yeah, here's how the filtration's gonna work. Level 1, level 2, level 3, problem solved. But yeah, this is all that there was. But they didn't let themselves get held back by the fact that they didn't 100% know exactly how it worked. Now, here's the amazing part of the story. So a engineering partner saw this on Kickstarter. It created a ton of buzz, raised a lot of money, and they said, we want to partner with you on this. We want to help you develop the technology to do this. And so they did, and they're developing it, they're testing it, and the royalties from the technology alone, from the patents that they're putting out on the technology, is actually going to partially subsidize the Plus pool. So, going big with your creativity means not feeling like you always have to have all your little ducks in a row before you're willing to put out a big idea. Sometimes you need to put out that big idea even if you don't know, even if it's just that first step on a journey, because creativity and imagination, that's part of what we can bring to the equation, right? We can see things differently than anyone has ever seen them before, and sometimes we hold that back, and sometimes it's time to just go big with it. Now, all of these lessons are really about being willing to take risks. At the end of the day, if you're not willing to put your neck out for something, you'll be playing small, right? You will be waiting for someone to give you permission. You'll be hanging out on the side, waiting to be invited in, right? It takes getting out there, putting your ideas forward, being willing to be wrong, right? Being willing to listen and then to find out that your initial instinct was wrong and to pick yourself up and to do it again, right? For me, I did not intend to start one business, let alone two. I was very much a rule follower. I really like to, I never wanted to have the instability of having to be responsible for my own salary. It wasn't what I wanted. But when I found myself in my last year of grad school, not really wanting to do thesis and knowing that there was a burning question that I wanted to answer, I took a risk and decided to go my own way. When I found myself a little bit later graduating and the research wasn't done and I wanted to finish it and I could have never conceived of myself not having a stable job, I told myself, I'm gonna take 6 months until my loans kick in and I'm just gonna, I'm gonna freelance until then, right? I can handle that. So I took another step. When I found myself, a while after that thinking, I think that there needs to be some kind of training, some way to get women to tap into their own power, and I think that my design school needs it. I decided to pitch the dean of students, and that was the start of Build Yourself workshop, right? So I took another step. And so when I found myself, a year later, trying to figure out, should I go work for someone else, applying for a job, half in, half out, and I didn't get it. I said, you know what? I'm going to treat my business like a 3-year fellowship, and I'm going to commit to it. And I took another step. When I found myself at one point with no projects on the horizon and having a client who had mistreated me, underpaid me, saying yeah, come back and work with us again. And I told them, I'm actually really booked up. I took another step. When I found myself 1 month having made $980 and realized that I probably should hire a business coach to help me figure out my positioning, and she cost $1,500, took another step. Each risk that you take builds on the last. These were what the risks were for me. For you, you may have a different set of fears, you may have a different set of trade-offs, you may have a different narrative, you may have other things that scare you. But if you want to do this work and you want to be a creative agent of change, the one thing that you can't afford to not do is to bring your full self with you to work, right? Full self in this. You have to be courageous. You have to be willing to face down those fears. You don't need to have a trust fund, but you do need to bring that full willingness to put yourself out there, to take risks, and to challenge yourself, even though sometimes you're going to be afraid. And that's how we do this work. So in the end, that question, right? That question, how can we be a creative agent of change, isn't a question, it becomes a commitment. Thank you.